Is Apocalypse about to destroy the X-Men from the inside out using Gambit? We've been waiting all season for his return, and seeing him transform into death might just be the team's ultimate undoing. Welcome to another episode of Where's the Remote, and today we're looking at the latest episode of X-Men 97. I'm Steven, and I'm here to break down the sci-fi, fantasy, and comic book adaptations everyone's talking about, peeling back the layers on the writing, animation, and if this adaptation actually sticks the landing. We're going to jump into the first pillar that I like to touch upon, which is the character and conflict. Obviously, this is the emotional core of the episode, and they are pretty straightforward with that emotional core. We literally start the episode with Rogue having a nightmare. She is dreaming of her time back in Genosha, where they were celebrating, peace for mutants and a location for mutants to live peacefully. And so she's in the air dancing, and we see Gambit on the floor, essentially waiting for her to descend, admiring the love of his life. This is obviously a shift from what we saw in season 1, where Rogue was actually dancing with Magneto, and Gambit saw, and he definitely felt away. But obviously, in this nightmare, Rogue realizes that, the Gambit that she loved or once knew is not present after they dance on the dance floor, and that the traumatized version of the character and the, undead version of the character is what actually exists now. And she kind of she wakes up out of this nightmare at some point, screaming after the resurrected Gambit touches her skin in the sort of nightmare. So this leads me to something that I came across on social media. I can't remember if it was TikTok or Twitter or whatever, but essentially someone was kind of breaking down, the intention behind Rogue, because there is like this famous meme from the original series in where Rogue is fighting Apocalypse. The team is fighting Apocalypse, and then there's a certain position where the animators clearly display how voluptuous of a woman Rogue is. And it just made me think about, the trauma that this character has experienced and how traumatized of an individual she is. Obviously, her power is essentially work in which she takes the life force of other people, which means for the most part that she has to stay with gloves on at all times. Otherwise, she could potentially kill people. And so it's a kind of oxymoron with that being her ability. And then she is a voluptuous woman who is obviously constantly being under the eyes of men and how she's viewed. And even in X-Men 97, as well as the original series, some of her dialogue always starts off whenever there's some sort of conflict of like, do not touch me, and look at this object of desire, but do not touch me. So we see some of the patriarchy in these adaptations as well. So to then, fast forward to X-Men 97, here's another traumatized a moment for Rogue where the love of her life, or someone she has deeply found affection for and love for, is, has been taken by Apocalypse and all of his testing and resurrecting from that sort of aspect. So I thought that was an interesting dynamic there. And then for something that I didn't love in this episode, we continue with this whole pity, emotional tie-in between Scott and Jean and Cable, and how bad they feel of having to abandon him in the future and essentially making him a child rebel soldier, which technically the X-Men have always been child rebel soldiers. And so I don't know. I'm just over it. Like it really shifts the tone every time those scenes sort of arise, and I'm kind of like, do I really need this? Like trying to meet him in some sort of way. And granted, in this scene, we do see Cable get a little bit emotional. I think his eyes start to well up a little bit. But other than that, I don't know, it just doesn't land for me. And I'm ready for them to kind of like move on and just accept that, which probably won't happen because we obviously have other scenes in the episode that kind of, point at some more conflict between both parties. But that angle is it just doesn't do it for me anymore. But a majority of the episode's focus was, Rogue and Gambit and their relationship dynamics and the events that happened there. And we obviously discovered that um, Apocalypse still exists and that Apocalypse has basically put his consciousness inside of Gambit in some sort of way. And it isn't until Rogue is able to actually save Gambit from this. Xavier tried to jump into his mind to save him, but was unsuccessful. And maybe that's a trauma that Xavier has experienced now with seeing Magneto dying. And then Rogue is the one that was able to actually free Gambit to an extent. We don't know. We could put an asterisk on that, but Rogue is the one that's able to free Gambit in this sort of scenario. And so it'll be very interesting to see, how this impacts the team moving forward, because it kind of does remind me of some events that happened in the original show, as we're seeing, Rogue save Gambit in this moment, and then the Apocalypse's consciousness basically enters inside of Gambit's spirit per se. So we'll see how that plays out in the series. But um as I was briefly mentioning, in the original series, we kind of have something somewhat similar, and what I predict will happen is that in the original series, and this is something they also touched upon in season 1 of X-Men 97, was Morph, after being kidnapped by Mr. Sinister and going through all the brainwashing and mind control, he has someone who suffers from a lot of PTSD. And so when he tries to fight the brainwashing, there are moments where he jumps in and out of returning to the X-Men and wanting to be a friend and wanting to resume his life as an X-Man, but he can't do so because that internal conflict of, whether he will convert to that evil version of himself that just wants the X-Men dead. So I think that might be something that they'll be trying to do with Gambit moving forward in this instance of, Gambit wants to be an active member of the team, but can he really when Apocalypse still lives inside of him? And yes, maybe we didn't really get a confirmation, but maybe Apocalypse putting his body into one of the X-Men was exactly what he wanted to do. So, how they can't kill one of their fellow mutants because, that's someone that they love and care for. So it'll be very interesting to see if that's something that they play with in these last 2 episodes, or even going into season 3 with, how they try to deal with Apocalypse essence inside of Gambit. But then the next pillar I want to get into is obviously the world building and the lore, some of the nerdy stuff per usual. But if you watch X-Men 97, you got to know to pay attention to the intro title card, intro sequence, whatever you want to call it, as always. And then this week, of course, they implemented some new stuff. So we, of course, get this scene with Rogue and Gambit. We, of course, get these scenes with some battles with Apocalypse between him and Cable, and then him and Archangel. And then what I did find interesting, and I'll play this over again, is towards the end, we do get this brief scene that they did play in one of the previous intros with X-Force fighting or training, I should say, Jubilee when she was an active member of the team, which I guess sorts of insinuates exactly what happens in this episode, exactly what happens at the end of the episode, and probably things that we'll see later on down the line is the conflict between the X-Men and now the X-Force and X-Factor teamed up. So it'll be interesting to see how that sort of plays out. And then, as I just mentioned, we had that scene at the very end of the episode where Cable, Archangel, and Psylocke are talking about how they're going to resolve this thing. And then X Factor comes in and basically says, hey, we're not here to capture you. And they're joined by Valerie Cooper. We're not here to capture you. We're actually here to team up, and that the next target is the X-Men because they're the ones that's getting in the way of our actual overall mission. And so, you know, we'll see how that goes. It'll be very interesting to see Cyclops reconnect with his brother, if they actually touch on that, if they make that sort of reveal. Um, and just seeing these X-Men actually fight people that some of them have been foes, some of them have been friends in some capacity. So, and then of course the whole Scott and Jean and how they want to deal with Cable sort of angle. So we'll see how that goes. And then which is also a tie to the original series as well, where the X-Men did fight the X Factor team at one point when Bobby, aka Iceman, was also going in between, what side of the fence he wanted to be on when it came to being an X-Men or not. I want to get into is the technical lens. Some of the stuff that we see on screen, especially from an animation standpoint, that stuck out to me. Obviously, for me, the highlight of the episode was Nightcrawler and his action sequence. And essentially, Nightcrawler has always been someone who kind of been more about peace and more about, his faith more than anything. But we do see that when Nightcrawler, and we had that epic scene in season 1 as well, but we do see Nightcrawler when he wants to lay shit down, he is able to do so. We see this action sequence where he basically is able to solo all of the X-Men and some of the other X-Force members by himself. Like, he does not bat an eye when it comes to it. He doesn't struggle in any sort of way. He's being able to use his teleportation powers to basically pull up on every single member and do what he needs to get done. And, lets them know, like, hey, I ain't no chump. I would love to know if someone could let me know in the comics as that scene just played, who is that character that Morph transformed into? I do not recognize that character from everything. As I've said on this channel before, I'm not a big comic book reader, so I'm not familiar with everything. I'm much more have the animated shows and movies as my foundation. So we'd love to know who that character was. So please let me know in the comics. But I think also from a technical aspect, I feel as though the pacing wasn't that great in this episode. We've been getting these hints that Gambit is alive with the season finale from season 1. Then some of the post-credit scenes or end of episode scenes throughout this season of Gambit returning. So then to have him come in and then essentially somewhat with an asterisk complete his arc, it just felt like, oh, okay, like, what was the buildup for? Like, we could have probably did this a little bit earlier. I would have felt this would have been more impactful if they were unable to reach Gambit in some sort of way, and that they were able to, Gambit and his horsemen were able to defeat the X-Men on multiple occasions in multiple instances until he found External and got, the gem to then power Rogue. Like, I would have liked that to happen more over multiple episodes versus, hey, we're introducing the character that you guys been teasing, and essentially we've repaired him again with an asterisk by the time the episode is over. And it's kind of like, okay, well, cool. I mean, now what's next? Like, now what do we do? So I don't know. It just felt a little bit rushed to me. Just a little bit rushed. And now for my actual final pillar, which is the adaptation check, is calling on to some of the source material, maybe ties to a original series, which I've made multiple references to as well. But we obviously have the scene where I mentioned where Gambit takes that gem and infuses it into Rogue. So again, it'll be very interesting to see how this sorts of plays out in the rest of the series, because we see that when they do have that flashback to talk about External, And if we remember earlier in the season when the team, half of the team was back in Egypt, you know, Kang or that Kang variant told external at that time, like, hey, you can't escape with me. Like, your job isn't done. Like, you have more that you need to do, in which he left her abandoned. And then we see in the flashback that Apocalypse gave some of his powers to external. And then Gambit, obviously, in this episode, resurrects Eternal so that he could steal his powers to then input that within Rogue. So it'd be very interesting to see, like, one, does Rogue develop new powers because of this? Does she become a bit more one-sided in terms of having undivided loyalty to Gambit because subconsciously it's the power of Apocalypse within her that's drawing her to Gambit, aka Apocalypse? And so how do they sort of deal with that? And like, does that then force the X-Force and X-Factor teams to, instead of fighting the X-Men, team up? Because now we have these two powerful beings that we need to handle, but we also need to handle them with care because these are also our loved ones. So it'll be very interesting to see how they sort of, wrap up this storyline when it comes to those specific characters. But, that's all that I have for, this episode. I'll jump into my final word, give my rating, and wrap things up here. So if you're new to the channel, we work on a 5 remote system, 1 being unwatchable, 5 being all-time great peak TV. For this episode, I have to give it a 3 out of 5. I think the emotional beats didn't necessarily do it for me. The pacing was kind of, I don't know, it didn't really work for me. And while there's some action sequences I like, I kind of was like, it is what it is. Like, when it feels like just another episode, finally moving the story along versus, some sort of side story to put these characters to do something other than the apocalypse of it all. But yeah, Rogue breaks Gambit out of Apocalypse's grip, but rush pacing and a new alliance between X-Factor and X-Force prove the mutant civil war may just be getting started. I'm curious, was Nightcrawler taking down the entire team the cleanest fight sequence of the season so far, or did another moment take the crown for you? Drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode on the channel. And if you want more deep dives, head over to our Patreon to unlock over 100 hours of reviews covering classic legacy TV shows like The Walking Dead, True Detective, Lovecraft Country, and just full uncut breakdowns on all of those mediums. Link is in the description down below. I'll be sure to check with you guys next time.